listen to me talk first. So my talk is East of Eternity, and today we're going to have the pleasure of hearing a live performance of the song cycle 12 Poems of Emily Dickinson by Aaron Copland. Both Dickinson and Copland are giants in American cultural history, and to hear Copland musically interpreting Dickinson's poetry is something I think you're really going to find interesting and enjoyable. And I promise you, we will have you out of here in an hour because I am going to be watching the Wildcats play tonight as well. So please have no fear. We are on the same team here. We're on the same page. Before I give you a preview of the music, I want to tell you a little bit about each of these figures. So Emily Dickinson, her dates are 1830 to 1886, lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, and was essentially a recluse. She rarely went out of her home, and few people came to visit her. His family, and her sister lived in relative isolation at home. However, Dickinson wrote frequently to friends and relatives, and she read widely in literature, philosophy, theology, and poetry. Dickinson was raised as an Orthodox Calvinist in a highly conservative Christian home, but her poetry often reflects her struggle to balance her religious upbringing with her experience of the world. And this is a theme that Aaron Copland found really fascinating and picked up on, and he draws this out in his particular song cycle that we're going to hear today. Emily Dickinson was not known as a poet during her lifetime, but when she died, her family discovered 40 hand-sewn volumes of poetry containing nearly 1,800 individual poems. Today, along with Walt Whitman, who was one of her contemporaries, she's known as one of the most distinctive voices in American poetry. Aaron Copland, born in 1900, died in 1990, likewise gave us a uniquely American compositional voice. The son of Russian Jewish immigrants, he was born in New York City and decided at a young age that he was going to be a composer. So he first started to try to learn the craft by taking a correspondence course. As you can imagine, that was not the most successful approach. But when he was 21, he received the opportunity to attend a compositional school in France, studying under Nadia Boulanger, who trained the composers of the 20th century across the world. After 3 years, he returned to New York and began an enormously successful career as a composer. He was influenced by many styles that you can hear reflected in his music, including classical, jazz, folk music, opera, and even the dissonant 12-tone compositional technique. He composed for film scores, including Of Mice and Men and Our Town. You may perhaps know him best from the music he wrote for two of his ballets, Rodeo and Appalachian Spring, as well as his fanfare for The Common Man. Pieces from these are still played in news broadcasts, advertisements, film scores, and band concerts routinely. The song cycle that we'll be listening to today was written at the peak of Copland's popularity in the 1940s, and it brings together the best of these two icons. So I've used the term song cycle a couple of times at this point, and I want to briefly explain what that is. In musical terms, a song cycle is a body of short pieces called art songs, which set the text of a single poet to music, and which are meant to be sung together in a specific order as a whole unit. So since they're meant to be heard as a whole, we ask that you hold your applause, even though there's 12 songs, please hold your applause until the very end of the song cycle. It'd be like listening to Pink Floyd and applauding after every track. You wouldn't do that, right? You'd wait till the very end. All right. At this time, I'd like to offer a few remarks on each of the pieces in the set. Since this marriage of classical voice and piano is not one that we hear too much of today, it's kind of nice to have something to listen for to help the experience be more meaningful. So think of me as kind of a live program notes that you're getting in advance of the performance. If you wouldn't mind taking out your program, thank you to my students who are passing out programs in the back, I appreciate that. So if you want to pull that out, the texts of each of the poems are contained within. And maybe we can take a look at this together, ACS style. Close reading. Okay, so first poem, Nature, the Gentlest Mother. This begins with the piano creating the sound of birds trilling, right? Because what's more quintessential to nature than, sort of the song of the bird. The poem presents a maternal image of nature, obviously, nature, the gentlest mother, which is portrayed by the music in a couple of ways. In most of the piece, the accompaniment sounds more like nature wrangling her playful children, chasing after the squirrels and the birds, except for the first and the fifth stanzas, which sound almost more like a lullaby. Nature is protective and nurturing in this song. She watches over, as you can see in the third verse, the feeblest or the waywardest. The religious language in the poem, you can see in the fourth stanza, the crickets offering their timid prayer in the aisles of their household. That religious imagery is not set by Copland in any particular way. It's not given any musical treatment. It really is just focused on the natural imagery. And as the sun sets in the last two verses, her golden finger on her lip wills silence everywhere. The vocal line sort of puts the world to bed and itself fades away, presumably until the next day's dawn. Flipping the page, second song, entitled There Came a Wind Like a Bugle. This depicts the natural world in all its ferocity and unpredictability, so a totally different view of nature. It starts with this abrupt upward scale. The vocal line is jagged, and the dissonant accompaniment races along behind the singer, evoking the feeling of the wind blowing forcefully and then quickly changing direction, carrying things, debris, along with it. The piece ends with the voice on a very low note, particularly for a coloratura soprano, which is used to sort of create a brief moment of respite, a little stillness in the wind. Turn to page, third song. The world feels dusty. Why do they shut me out of heaven? Not turning the page, it's on the bottom. Sorry. All right, so why do they shut me out of heaven is one that I actually want you to really take particular note of. It's not particularly long, so if you want to go ahead and read it right now, I think it's really worth noting. Because in this piece, we're going to hear a lot of the poetic themes and the musical themes that Copland uses to create his cohesive sequence of songs. So first, there's a lot of tone painting in this song. So tone painting is when the words say something and the music creates a picture of it. It's pretty easy, right? So like when they talk about a bird, the piano trills in birdsong. When they talk about a bell, the piano clangs like a bell. Both the instances of tone painting in this piece have to do with the sense of hearing, which is one of the themes that Copland draws out of Dickinson's poetry. The beginning sounds like clanging church bells, and when the word bird is sung, you get the little twitter on the piano. Copland tried to use Dickinson's poems in their entirety, exactly as she wrote them, but in this piece we see one of the few occasions where he took some artistic liberties to highlight some phrases that he thought were particularly important. So Copland has the singer repeat the final line of the poem, "Could I forbid," 3 times. So you can see that that's actually not the last line in this text, because Copland elects to add the first 2 lines of the poem to the end, which really changes the whole feeling of the poem, right? He ends the song with more of a melodic, hopeful strain of song, which seems to me, at least on the surface, like a radically different tone from the confusion, that emotion of confusion, of sadness, that the actual poem ends with, "Could I forbid?" And if you look at the poem, Emily Dickinson's posing a really interesting question. Who could turn away someone who knocked on the doors of heaven, right? If you were the gatekeeper and someone knocked, would you be able to say no? She feels like she would be incapable of that. And yet the narrator in this poem is the one being closed out of eternity, certainly of a traditionally religious sense of eternity. So the refusal of this gatekeeper to let her in stands in stark contrast to the first poem of the song cycle. Remember, nature, the gentlest mother is. And remember, this anthropomorphized Mother Nature protects the feeblest, and the waywardest. Instead, this male gentleman, gatekeeper, seems strikingly uncharitable for being the guardian of heaven when a little hand knocks on the gate. So this introduces yet another of the poetic themes in the cycle, the isolation, the increasing isolation of the speaker and her despair of ever attaining to an afterlife. When we look at the earlier stanzas of the poem, we see there about the narrator envisioning being shut out and even asking to be given another chance, saying in the second stanza, "Oh, I'd be really good, I wouldn't cause any trouble." That said, Copland's musical setting does not permit this narrator to be victimized. When he has the singer return to the beginning and repeat those first two verses, "Why do they shut me out of heaven? Did I sing too loud?" The singer is instructed in the music to sing at a strong fortissimo, extra loud, extra assertive, completely unrepentant for whatever caused her to be denied entrance, and in fact almost defiantly repeating, "Sorry, did I sing too loud?" Right? So I think that might be Copland's sense of humor in this too. But I think it's just interesting to note that that is different than Dickinson's original ending. Now turning the page to "The World Feels Dusty." This song begins with piano chords that rock back and forth. The first line of the poem reminds us of Genesis and the image of the human person being formed from dust and clay, but then returning to dust at death. In this first stanza, worldly honors lose their savor, and heavenly waters suddenly seem more desirable. But by the second and third stanzas, it seems that the friends' ministrations for the dying person actually provide more real comfort than the desire for a heaven that we cannot see and may be left out of. Number 5, "Heart, We Will Forget Him," is the story of the narrator lamenting over an unrequited love. Emily Dickinson has a lot of unrequited love in her poetry. There are a few scholarly theories about who that may have been, but the fact is that we just don't know who that man was. But we do see a pattern beginning to emerge in the subject matter of Copland's selections of Dickinson's poetry. He seems to be choosing poems that stress the increasing isolation and exclusion of the poem's narrator from the world, from heaven, and now even from friends. Because in this piece, the narrator is now addressing only herself. The I-thou relationship in this poem is the woman and her own heart, which is imaged by the music in the piano, which plays pulsing quarter notes, almost like a musical heartbeat in dialogue with the singer. Despite the sadness of the poem, the melody is quite beautiful and does not sound of despair. Now, another poem that I want to spend a little extra time on is the poem number 6, "Dear March, Come In." This one is a lot of fun. It shifts the tone entirely, providing a boost of energy. In this song, the piano dances and tumbles around an exultant vocal line. The bird trill is back. You'll hear the birds, as birds are sort of one of the biggest harbingers of the spring. The rise and fall of the vocal line makes it sound almost conversational, like she really is excitedly greeting an unexpected guest at the door. Today, we are also eagerly anticipating the change in the cycle of the seasons and the coming of spring. Winter can seem interminable, but when it ends, it suddenly seems like it was not so long at all. As Dickinson writes, "Trifles seem so trivial as soon as you have come," in the final stanza. And to mark the joy of spring's arrival, Copland actually writes a closing chord that sounds like the piece is finished and happy. So note that. So far, Dickinson and Copland are presenting strikingly different conceptions of nature. So we've had the doting mother, making you home-cooked meals, sympathizing with you about how hard your exams and your papers are. Now nature's depicted as your fun friend who just got back from a trip to Amsterdam and has tons of uproarious stories to tell you. So this vision of nature is not serious, it's not transcendent, it's really rather superficial, focusing on all of her more sensual pleasures in her sights and her sounds. And both of these contrast significantly with the tone of "Why do they shut me out of heaven?", in which the poetic narrator is the one shut out. In "Dear March, Come In," The narrator is now the one with the power to answer the door, to welcome, and she opens the door gladly to March, albeit with more of a playful pout for April. The season's breach in manners for disappearing for a whole year before returning again is not a serious offense, but merely a trifle, something easily overlooked. Moving on to the 7th song. The 7th and 12th, which is the final, the 7th and 12th songs are musically connected. So that's something to listen carefully for at the very beginning. This is one of the few notes that Copland himself gave when he was asked, how is this a song cycle? He said, well, the 7th and the 12th are linked in their thematic material. So listen to the opening melody of Sleep is Supposed to Be. You'll hear a dotted, jagged rhythm in the piano. And then see if you can recall it and hear it return in the final piece of the cycle. Dickinson's use of the word sleep in this poem is similar to the religious metaphor for sleep, which means death, while the coming of the dawn is a symbol of the resurrection. So the opening melodic line is depicting death and is marked to be played deliberately and with dignity. You can actually hear the religious imagery reflected in this accompaniment. It has a dignified, quasi-sacred tone. But then there's a huge shift in the poem, and the accompaniment follows when the singer proclaims, towards the end, in that single solitary line, "Morning has not occurred." And remember, morning is the resurrection, right? Morning has not occurred. The style here becomes disconnected. Copland marks marcato, clamorous, reminding us of the narrator's voice reveling in her own power at the beginning and end of Why Do They Shut Me Out of Heaven? Did I sing too loud? In Sleep is Supposed to Be, the singer finds herself not among the saved, not residing in heaven, but rather east of eternity in the final stanza, which you may recall is the title of my talk. For the poet, this is where the dawn is truly located, not within a religious narrative, but within our earthly life and experience. Copland sets this new vision to music with raucously dissonant chords that are loud and in our face. He further reinforces Dickinson's contrast between what is supposed to be by souls of sanity and people of degree with what the poetic narrator actually thinks by setting the final line, that is the break of day. This is eternity. This is the afterlife, with confidence, setting it off with a brief rest before the line is sung for greater emphasis. It is the here and the now that matter to Dickinson, and Copland wants to be sure we let her point sink in before moving on. He indicates that a long, weighty pause occur between songs 7 and 8 for us to consider the full import. So that won't be an accident when you hear a bit of a break there. Song 8, When They Come Back. This has a playful feel, similar to Dear March, Come In. Its jagged melodies are backed by a piano line that dances along at a good clip. The whole thing seems good-natured, fun, even a bit mischievous. However, before the 4th stanza, there is again a sharp change. The tempo slows dramatically, and the music grows more reflective. When we look back at the words, we see that this has actually been foreshadowed by all the contingent statements that are set off by little pauses beforehand. In stanza 1, if blossoms do. In stanza 2, if robins do. In stanza 3, if may return. And then in the last stanza, if I am there. The first 3 phrases emphasize the transience of the natural world and the poet's occasional doubt that the seasons will indeed cycle around each year. But the final iteration shifts to the self, if I am there, to indicate the mortality of the human person. While the last line, I take back all I say, could be set flippantly, like a joke, Copland chooses to give it a sweeter sense of finality. The 9th song. The musical imagery in this, I felt a funeral in my brain. I think right there you know that this one's going to have a big impact, right? I mean, that is a memorable line. I felt a funeral in my brain. That's easy to pick up on. The piano plays a complex dirge with a pounding rhythm throughout, producing the effect of the mourner's footsteps. And remember, this is pounding in her head. Many of the poem's lines, you'll notice, begin with and when, and then, which gives a momentum that pushes the song forward, almost with the steps of the pallbearers. Copland chose to have the words treading in the first stanza and beating in the second stanza repeated 3 times to have the vocal line reflect this throbbing rhythm of the piano. The voice sings a dark melody punctuated by noticeably dissonant intervals that often disruptively clash against the piano's part. The voice is also used to create the sound of the dead spirit sighing with these falling intervals, while the piano tolls like a bell. So note in the text that the only sense Dickinson is emphasizing is the sense of hearing. So again, Copland has pulled a poem that focuses on the sense of hearing. She even says in the final stanza, being but an ear, right? Because before that, she's just been hearing that pulsation, right? It's all audible. But then, being but an ear, I and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here, right? We move to silence. When the bells of heaven ring in this final stanza, the narrator seems to have fallen deaf. She only hears silence, and she's left alone, unhearing. The vocal line is supposed to fade in the last measures of music, while the thudding piano continues at its previous volume, sort of overpowering the voice in death. The next song, I've heard an organ talk sometimes. This presents me with the opportunity to put in a plug for our final program in the concert series, an organ concert by one of the attendees here today and his class. Thanks so much. Dr. Chris Daly. So if you look at the very back of your program, not the back cover, but the inside back cover, you'll see a brief little blurb on it. Wednesday, April 4th, 7 p.m. in St. Thomas of Villanova Church. It's our final event in the ACS concert series. Dr. Daly is an excellent organist. He's going to be performing pieces by Buxtehude, Bach, Franck, and Vidor, ACS approved. And if you've never heard an organ talk before, even if you have, you should definitely attend this. It's a great way to be introduced to the instrument in a whole new way. Okay, back to the music today. I've heard an organ talk sometimes. We find ourselves in a cathedral with Emily Dickinson in this 10th poem. The narrator of this is not singing too loudly this time, but rather sitting in silence, listening to the strains of the organ. While the accompaniment is meant to remind us of the chords of a hymn tune, the chords become a little dissonant once the singer enters, perhaps to illustrate that while the narrator is captivated by the beauty of the music, she also fails to comprehend the traditional religious messages. Again, through the music, we are shown Emily Dickinson's emphasis on personal experience through her senses. Sorry, I thought I skipped a page. I didn't. Through her senses, over and above more widely accepted religious practices and beliefs. She acknowledges that she has been changed in some meaningful way by the sacred music. She says she feels more Bernardine or holy, like St. Bernard of Clairvaux, but she can't describe how. The experience is spiritual, but in an unconventional way. Listen in particular for the last line in that old hallowed isle. It sounds almost like the belting of a gospel tune. All right, next, Going to Heaven, poem 11, begins and ends with the motif of the piano racing upwards high in the keyboard. And I sort of envision it like a lady picking up her skirts and whisking upstairs to prevent herself from tripping. It's a sort of very delicate upward race. The voice has the same excited, chattering sound as we will have heard in Dear March, Come In. But what seems to be playful excitement actually in this song is a bit more satirical. since the final stanza begins, "I'm glad I don't believe it," meaning believe in heaven. It turns out that the narrator is in no rush to go anywhere after death, because she's enjoying her time on earth, thank you very much, and furthermore, she doesn't quite believe that there is an anywhere to go to after we die. So all of this comes around to the final song of the cycle, the Chariot. This is the first Dickinson poem that Aaron Copland actually set to music, the first one that sort of attracted his attention. And so I think we should pay particular attention to this as well, because it gives us some insights into the themes that he found particularly attractive in Dickinson's poetry. So he really liked in her voice the serious and thoughtful notes, but also those that are witty and irreverent, which we hear a lot of as well. This last piece brings together all of these, sort of tying the program together. The opening piano music repeats the lilting rhythmic motif from Sleep is Supposed to Be. So if you remember, number 7, that dotted rhythmic thing that you're supposed to remember, here it's gonna come back, all right? And remember, sleep equals death. Death in this piece is anthropomorphized into a visitor, not unlike the month of March in Dear March Come In. However, when death knocks, it's not to say that he'll see you again next year. This is the end of the ride. But unlike I Heard a Funeral in My Head, this song is surprisingly peaceful for a song about death. It's also kind of refined. Death is depicted as a gentleman, right? So once the gentleman helps her into his stately carriage, he takes the narrator on a leisurely drive around places from her past. And then once they arrive at her grave, they don't really say that she is going to be interred. It's like she continues on the carriage ride with death into eternity. She sees the horses' heads pointed towards eternity. So she's living on in some kind of afterlife, just not heaven. The only musical hint of all of this spirituality is perhaps the final note the singer has, very high and sustained on the final syllable of the word eternity. So the poems featured in this song cycle explore a number of tensions between absolutes, life and death, the natural world and the spiritual world, the heart and the head. The music reflects these contrasts with its own tensions between harmony and dissonance, tranquility and chaos, the concrete and the abstract. What makes these songs so interesting to me is that it's unclear what is matched with what. Heaven is not always depicted as peaceful, but neither is the earth. Reason does not necessarily triumph, but neither does sensuality. So that concludes my portion. Before we begin the music, I just want to take a brief moment to thank the people who have made this event possible. The Augustine and Culture Seminar Program, Dr. Hill, who you saw introduce me at the very beginning, sponsors this so generously, and we're really grateful that she has given us the opportunity to put this program forward. And we are also co-sponsored today by the English department, so thank you to Heather Hicks in English. Lastly, our reception is sponsored by the Matthew J. Ryan Center, so enjoy a brownie or a cookie or an Arnold Palmer on the Ryan Center, and stop by their place in Old Falvey if you have a moment. So please turn off your phones. Remember to hold your applause until the end of all 12 songs. And now it's my pleasure to introduce soprano Elizabeth Springuel and pianist Barbara Browne. Thank you.
Praise Going to heaven, going to heaven, going to heaven. I don't know when. Pray do not ask me how. Indeed, I'm too astonished to think of answering you. Going to heaven, going to heaven. It will be done, as sure as flocks go home at night and to the shepherd's house. Perhaps you're going to, who knows? If you should get there first, save just a little place for me close to the two I lost. The smallest robe will fit me, and just a bit of brown, for you know we do not mind our dress when we are going home. Going to heaven, going to heaven. I'm glad I don't believe it, for it would stop my breath. And I'd like to look a little more at such a curious head. I am glad they did believe it, whom I have never found since the mighty autumn afternoon I left them in the because I would not stop for day, they kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves,